In this first slide, you are looking at a patent taken from a book containing all manner of new inventions made during the 1810s. The particular patent you see here was awarded in the year 1815. That is within the lifetime of Beethoven. He was 45 in that year, and he still had 12 more years to write the masterpieces of his late period. The recipient of the patent was a German inventor by the name of Melzel, Johann Nepomuk Melzel. Not a name you need to remember for the exam, but his invention is important. Melzel called his new invention the metronome, a name that combines the Greek words for measure and law. Its purpose was to indicate tempo with mathematical precision. By tempo, I mean beats per minute, not the subjective sensation of speed of which I spoke 2 weeks ago. The metronome does this by sounding clicks whose frequency per minute you can adjust at will. For example, you can choose to set the tempo to 122 beats per minute. But if 121 feels more comfortable, you set it to that. In fact, the metronome can do any tempo between 40 beats per minute and 208. Here is how it works. There is a slider on a kind of swinging pendulum. Its position on that pendulum, higher or lower, determines the precise number of beats per minute. The numbers are indicated on the body of the metronome behind the pendulum. Right now, you see the slider set to the lowest possible value, 40. And here is how you change that to 60. And so on all the way down to the number at the bottom, 208. Once you have set the slider, you give the pendulum a push, and immediately it will swing to the pace which is natural to that setting. Here is a setting that would be quite natural to us, as it is the optimal resting heart rate of 60. The advantage of the slider is that you can make minute distinctions between one tempo and another. Remember the other week when we listened to 2 performances of the violin concerto by Vivaldi. One was played at a stately pace, and the other, as I put it at the time, was like a person on a mini tricycle trying to keep up with a car going 15. Now, with the help of the metronome, we can now measure the tempos of these 2 performances, or if you prefer the Italian plural, the 2 tempi. Let's listen to them again. First the stately version, and then the tricycle version. 140. A heart rate of 140 is dangerous in humans. One should probably go to the emergency room if one's heart were really racing that fast. But it is dangerous also in good music. Call me a grumpy old professor, but I see no merit in the tempo choice of the second recording. Frankly, I think it destroys the music. Now, the reason I begin this lecture with the metronome is that it was instantly successful in the 1810s and made its inventor a rich man. Of course, the instrument is also still popular today. A search on Amazon yields dozens of metronomes with designs ranging from the classical to the cutesy. If you happen not to like pink rabbits, try the bear or the cat. As a last resort, choose the panda. And if even that doesn't work, then maybe you are of the same opinion as I am, which is that the metronome is a completely pointless device. I cannot think of a single reason why I would want to have one in my house. It's true that a moment ago I used metronome counts to indicate the tempo of the Vivaldi concerto in different recordings, but no instrument could be less suited to arrive at those counts than the metronome. Imagine having to adjust the slider again and again, and finding every time that it's either a little too fast or a little too slow, until you have played the movement so often that you're just tired of the whole exercise. The easy way to measure tempo is the same way you measure heartbeat, with a watch, counting beats until you have finished a minute. That should take a lot less time. I guess somewhere in the region of 1 minute would be close. The only other reason why a metronome might be useful is that there are markings in many scores, especially of piano music. It is well known that Beethoven saw great potential in the device and for a while supplied metronome markings enthusiastically. Here you see an example in the famous Hammerklavier Sonata, barely 3 years after the patent was awarded. It even says Melzel's metronome, an early example of product placement that I assume will not have been wholly to Beethoven's financial disadvantage. Surely he expected Melzel to pay for the favor. After all, because of the marking, you couldn't play Beethoven's sonata properly unless you bought a metronome. Now, it says here in the score 138 half notes in a minute. What does that mean concretely? That is easily illustrated, for the modern computer has no difficulty playing a piece of music at a mathematically precise tempo, any tempo. Here is the beginning of the sonata at the speed Beethoven seems to have called for. Now, I don't know about you, but I sense that there might be a problem here. Let's just say that it is very fast. Very, very fast. And this piece is not exceptional in that regard. Many of the tempo indications Beethoven wrote in his scores are by universal agreement absurdly fast. A sensible performer would cast those indications aside and choose the tempo that made the most musical sense. Here's a good example from a live performance by Vladimir Ashkenazy in 1980, now 40 years ago. In the first minute, his average speed is not 138, as Beethoven indicated, but only 104, 3/4 of the authorial speed. That is a sizable difference, very close to the tempo difference we heard in the Vivaldi concerto. Music historians have long suspected that there must have been something wrong with Beethoven's metronome. Discussions about this are still ongoing, and maybe there was something wrong. We'll never know for certain. But to my mind, that's not the real problem. There is something wrong about the metronome altogether. It allows one to write an arbitrary figure in the score and then expect the player to observe it, presumably by setting the metronome at the desired speed and then marching along with it in performance. My parents used to have a metronome, presumably because my piano teacher had told them to buy one. It was wasted on me. As a kid, I was uninterested in any music other than the songs I heard on the radio, and the late 60s were a great time to grow up listening to rock songs. I regarded the piano lessons as an intolerable imposition on my time. I had better things to do. And thanks to active non-cooperation on my part, I managed to play so bad that I wouldn't have been able to keep up with the metronome at any speed. A life-altering experience at age 15 would change all that. But even after that experience, my favorite composer was Chopin, and as we will see in a moment, the last thing you need when playing Chopin is a metronome. So either we ignore metronome markings, as Vladimir Ashkenazy did just now, or we allow them to overrule our own musicianship. In the latter case, we would no more than deserve becoming the dupes of the defective metronome of Beethoven, or perhaps some stupid printing error in the score. How can we surrender our musical sense to a directive supposedly coming from the composer? There is a visual analog of the problem I've signaled here. It is a very interesting experiment known as metronome synchronization. Essentially, the idea is that you take multiple metronomes, put the slider in the same position in each one of them, and then line them up on a board that is free to move left and right in the same direction as the pendulum. For example, you could place the chord on rollers, or on foam, or suspend it with cords. When all this is set up, you set the metronomes in motion randomly, doesn't matter in what order or what timing. Chaos will ensue. Now we leave the metronomes running for a bit, and we come back a minute later. What we see is a bunch of metronomes completely out of sync. I like to think of it as an image of a country blessed with the First Amendment. Now let's leave it alone for another minute. Coming back 2 minutes into the experiment, we see something resembling a country unified by a common purpose, a sense of shared discipline and responsible citizenship. Not all the metronomes are quite in sync, but you'd have to play this clip in slow motion to see the dissenters. There's actually quite a few of them. Give it another minute. When we return 3 minutes into the experiment, things are getting a little spooky. There is virtually no dissent left. Every metronome is marching in line. Wait, where have I seen this before? Ah, yes, now it's coming back. The juxtaposition of clips is not very subtle, I know. In fact, it's a bit manipulative. I apologize. But it does illustrate the fundamental problem with the metronome as I see it. If total conformity is what metronomes do to each other, at least when they're on the shaky ground of a movable board, should we let them do the same to us by slavishing marching to the beat? That would make us no better than another metronome. There is no musicianship to be had in such an attitude. Yet there is one beautiful thing about the experiment. When you fix the board and make it immovable, it turns out that the metronomes quickly go out of sync again. Each metronome can do what it likes. I say let's call that stabilized board the US Constitution. And yet, if I feel such distaste for the metronome, how do I explain that it was so popular in Beethoven's time? That's exactly the question I want to ask in this lecture. I raise it because it has deep ramifications for Western musical culture. Mechanically, there is nothing especially complicated about the metronome. It could have been invented in the 14th century, which could otherwise boast the massive technological achievement of the church organ, or the 13th, which saw the invention of the mechanical clock. But people at the time weren't interested. They didn't see the point, or else they would have invented the metronome. It was not until the 1810s that the invention caught on. Something must have changed to make people think that metronomes were a really great idea. The idea must have struck a deep chord. But what was it? One possible clue comes from the activities of a composer named Carl Czerny. He had been a student of Beethoven, and he had heard performances conducted by old Haydn. With the invention of the metronome, he could now draw on these memories and put an exact figure on the tempos that the great masters had used in their works. And so Czerny supplied them in newly published arrangements and editions of these same works. And people loved it. They took them seriously. Although the composers themselves were long dead, the metronome gave people a means to hold on to something that would otherwise have died with them. The markings recalled by Czerny had the authority of composer autographs. In all of this, we can recognize the cult of the genius composer, the composer whose intentions it behooves us to observe and respect. Why were composers so worshipped? It all goes back to the void that had been left by the decline of magic, the supposed emptiness of musical sound per se. The substance that music was seen to lack in the 18th century was thought now to be supplied by composers, at least the good ones. Hofmann had claimed, in his review of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that instrumental music was the most romantic of all arts, and Beethoven the most romantic of all composers. It was not long until music was universally acknowledged to be the very summit of artistic expression. One art historian summed it all up with the axiom, all art constantly aspires towards the condition of music. Score for music. Composers could bring that musical condition to ever greater heights. And thanks to the metronome, their intentions could now be preserved, even with regard to tempo. Before we move on, here's a quick review of the key concepts so far. First of all, the metronome. Then we have the abbreviation MM standing for Melzer's metronome. In scores, this abbreviation is typically followed or preceded by an equals sign plus the number of beats per minute. Tempo is that number. And then there is a new expression introduced in the Romantic period, tempo giusto, Italian for the right tempo or the appropriate tempo. What it means is the tempo that feels right to the performer. It's a paradoxical expression. Why would you even need it? Musicians had always performed at the tempo that felt right to them throughout the centuries. After all, if you can't leave it to them to pick the right tempo, then who can you leave it to? But now in the Romantic period, this was something that needed to be spelled out. If the correct tempo is by default the tempo indicated by the composer, then you need a new expression to let performers know that they are temporarily off the leash. That expression was tempo giusto. There was another new expression that pushed this idea even further, tempo rubato, robbed or stolen tempo. This is a deliberately perverse tempo, consciously going against the rigidity of the beat, in a display of performative freedom. It represents a kind of willful defiance of the metronome. Now let's turn to an item in our awesome mix. It is number 74, the slow movement of Frédéric Chopin's first piano concerto. This watercolor of Chopin was made not long after he had written that concerto. Amazingly, only 4 years ago, a photograph came to light which shows the same composer about 10 years later, when he had suffered years of ill health. He does not look a happy man. Chopin would die of tuberculosis at age 39. Chopin is the quintessential romantic composer. He wrote only for piano, with or without other instruments. Chopin was capable of making you momentarily forget that the piano is fundamentally a percussive instrument. He made it sing in ways that are almost beyond comprehension. The most difficult thing to compose throughout history is not a complicated fugue, but the light, delicate, and exquisite style of composers like Christian Bach or Frédéric Chopin. They make it sound so simple, but it is almost impossible to imitate. The slow movement of Chopin's concerto is breathtaking. Let's take a moment and imagine a young Star-Lord hearing this movement as part of his awesome mix way back in the year 1988.
Peter, your mama wants to speak to you. Come on, Pete.
A moment ago, I said that Chopin was capable of making the piano sing rather than simply hammer away at the strings. What exactly did I mean by that? At bottom, his lyrical power lies in a simple division of labor between left hand and right hand. In this example, I have grayed out the orchestral parts so we can concentrate on the piano alone. The left hand provides a gently strumming accompaniment, simple enough to leave the stage free for the melody in the right hand. You'll hear it now in a rendering on the computer, which means absolute metronomic fixity. The right hand imitates the human voice. It plays a lyrical melody in a single line without a chord anywhere. The melody is not technically demanding, but it does require great delicacy and a keen awareness of the sonoric possibilities of the piano. Obviously, the computer cannot be said to meet such requirements, and by the end of this example, we'll hear its deficiencies in that regard. Obviously, the music requires a more delicate touch. Here is how the same passage sounds when played by an actual human. For Chopin, it clearly mattered a great deal that performers would summon all their musicianship to make this passage as richly expressive as possible. It looks as if there couldn't be enough words in the Italian language to impress this on musicians. Just look at this one page. At the beginning of the stave, the performer is told to play the music delicatissimo e legatissimo in the most delicate and smoothly flowing fashion. In the very next measure, it says diminuendo e rallentando, decreasing in loudness and slowing down. But not for long. For the measure after that begins with the instruction a tempo, meaning back to the original tempo. This gives the strings two measures to play more regularly and less impressionistically than the piano. But that too is not for long. No sooner does the piano enter again, or Chopin writes legato, smoothly flowing, in the left hand, and leggerissimo in the lightest possible fashion in the right hand. Now, this latter instruction is not superfluous, for the same right hand is supposed to do the impossible and play 19 notes against 4 in the left hand. I can get my computer to play that, but with predictable results. It is mathematically exact, but it lacks the sense of carefree abandon that Chopin calls for. Now, this expressive style is largely a matter of tempo, and especially of extreme fluctuations in tempo, fluctuations even within the space of one measure. In the most expressive passages, there simply is no tempo, no regular tempo at any rate. The music is like a malleable substance that alternately solidifies, melts, and even evaporates according to the emotional temperature it is exposed to. Let's make those tempo fluctuations visible in a longer stretch of the awesome mixed performance. The pianist is Christoph Zimmermann, who is widely acknowledged to be perhaps the foremost Chopin interpreter of our time. During the sound clip, I will indicate the tempo by plotting the metronome readings for each measure in the graph below the score. The vertical axis on the left gives the range of tempos, varying from 10 beats per minute to 60. Now, if the tempo was strictly regular in rigidly metronomic fashion and never changed even in the slightest, then of course we should expect to see a straight horizontal line stretching from left to right and corresponding to only one number on the vertical axis. We already know that this won't be the case. The question is now what graph we will actually end up with. This is what I mean by no tempo at all. The lowest value is 18, a virtual standstill. The highest is more than 3 times as much, 56. It's a huge difference, one that vastly exceeds the difference between the two performances of Vivaldi. Of course, the music is rapturously beautiful, but it is equally obvious that a composition like this, there is no place for a metronome. It would simply kill the music. So we're left with a paradox. The very age that made tempo in performance more irregular than ever before invented a device to make it more rigidly regimented than it had ever been. That cannot be coincidence. Somehow there must be two underlying trends that react to each other and in some way perhaps feed off of each other. One could perhaps say that the extremely flexible performance style represents an aspiration to complete freedom, far beyond the strictures of conventional meter and tempo. On the other hand, the invention of the metronome seems to reflect an anxiety about that sense of total abandon in performance, the loss of compositional control, the dissolution of musical form into a shapeless mass, into a stream of musical lava that glows with emotion, but is devoid of disciplined thought. For someone who had that anxiety, the metronome at least provided the assurance of regularity, a secure yardstick, something you could still hold on to. And this is connected to a certain nostalgia for classical perfection in music. In retrospect, the supreme formal control of Mozart, Christian Bach, and Haydn and their contemporaries made their works the classical examples of a musical ideal. That is why the late 18th century became known, and still is known today, as the classical period in music. The contradiction between these two trends did in fact pervade musical life throughout the Romantic period. It would soon lead to bitter polemics, eventually even opposing camps. Here is one protagonist in these polemics, Eduard Hanslick, a music critic active in Vienna. You don't need to remember his name for the exam, but the school of thought he represents is important. Hanslick strongly objected to what he viewed as the loss of formal control in contemporary music, the unbridled indulgence in feelings and emotions. In 1854, he published a booklet called Vom musikalisch Schönen, concerning the beautiful in music. It has proved enormously influential, even to the present day. So, what did Hanslick regard as beautiful in music? What is it that we should be listening for? His answer has become famous in the original German. It was tönend bewegte Formen, forms that are sounding and are in motion. That was the beautiful, he said, and according to Hanslick, we would be well advised to listen for those forms. What we should absolutely not listen for, and not experience while listening, is mere emotion, sentiment, feeling. Hanslick spent chapter after chapter of his treatise fulminating against the aesthetics of mere feeling, which he saw everywhere around him. For Hanslick, the most elevated musical experience was a kind of intellectual contemplation, the objective appraisal of an abstract form that could be called beautiful, but did not depict anything, nor evoke a subjective emotion. His ideal composer was Johannes Brahms, whom he and many others regarded as a romantic classicist. According to Hanslick's opponents, Brahms was the saint at whose shrine he worshipped. I find it ironic, for in the awesome mix we have a piece by Johannes Brahms that can only be described as a sprawling mass of ideas, modulating this way and that, nothing like the music of the classical period. But that is because we haven't yet listened to the opposite pole of Brahms, and the protagonist of the other camp, who is none other than our old friend Richard Wagner. Wagner was the archfoe of Hanslick. There are so many ways in which he has come to stand for the dissolution of the contemporary musical language that I can only pick out one. But that one thing is the most consequential of all the novelties he introduced. It has to do with tonality. And for this, we have to go back to a topic I've discussed many times before, the cadence. The simple chord progression of the cadence, invented in the 14th century, is the ultimate foundation of tonality. What makes it capable of sustaining the whole complex edifice of tonality is that simple force of gravity I mentioned before, the feeling of anticipation, the sense that one chord is somehow inconclusive and awaits its resolution in the arrival of another. Let's play the three prototypical examples once again. In each of these, you can hear the final chord as the resolution of the one before it. Yet, the third progression by Wagner is different in that the final chord still awaits a resolution of its own. Let's hear it again. So, what is the resolution that is awaited here? What is it that the audience is left expecting? It is this. This cadential progression is the signature motive of the opera Tristan und Isolde. We hear it for the first time in the overture, which is item number 77 in the awesome mix. In the following clip, we will hear the motive 3 times in succession. Each time it is left open-ended. Instead of a resolution, we just hear the same progression again, but at a different pitch. The overall sense is that there is no resolution to be had, not ever. In the more than 4 hours it takes to sit through Tristan und Isolde, you never hear a resolution, not until the very last measures, when lo and behold, the opera concludes with a finally final chord. Let's skip the 4 hours and go straight to the end. I suppose that is a satisfying moment when it arrives, but it is far too late. No force of gravity can hold 4 hours of unresolved music together, or indeed can keep all spectators inside the opera theatre. Mark Twain found Wagner's operas a trying experience, as he remembers in a text published posthumously in his autobiography. He says, "I have witnessed and greatly enjoyed the first act of everything which Wagner created. But the effect on me has always been so powerful that one act was quite sufficient. Whenever I have witnessed 2 acts, I have gone away physically exhausted, and whenever I have ventured an entire opera, the result has been the next thing to suicide." Anyhow, To imprint the Tristan Progression more firmly in your memory, here is a clever use of it in an arrangement of the song Happy Birthday. The historical ramifications of the Tristan Progression have been enormous. I will explore them in the next lecture. Wagner has in fact been astonishingly influential, not only on composers of his own time, but well into the 20th century. Since I am a big fan of the film music of Bernard Herrmann, and don't mind an excuse to incorporate him in my lectures, here is a clip which shows him at his most Wagnerian. It is probably the most Wagnerian film score ever written. It comes from the Hitchcock movie Vertigo of 1958. One of the items of the awesome mix that shows the influence of the Tristan Progression is number 80. It is a so-called symphonic poem by the French composer Claude Debussy, entitled Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. Debussy was a profound admirer of Wagner, and we're going to pick out one moment which portrays the influence of the Tristan Progression. The music conjures up a dreamy, languid world with eroticism never far from the surface, or so people tell me. Let's now hear that climactic Wagnerian moment again. Reduced to simple chords, this is what it comes down to. To anticipate the topic of our next lecture, some near the end of the Romantic period felt that Wagner had really precipitated a crisis. In their view, he had exhausted the possibilities inherent in tonality. Music could not make further progress except by drawing the logical consequences from this, which was to cast aside tonality and develop something that could fulfill an equivalent role. The composer who felt called upon to do the pioneering work in this regard was Arnold Schoenberg. I will have enough to say about him in the next lecture, but today I want to conclude with what is probably Schoenberg's most Wagnerian composition, Verklärte Nacht, Illuminated Night. Some have called this moldy Wagner, I guess somewhat like blue cheese. I should probably bring an attitude of greater reverence to Schoenberg's setting, which is deservedly famous. But we're approaching the end of what has turned out to be a difficult semester for us all. Sadly, in this final week, it's getting harder and harder to conceal my personal preferences and prejudices. But I will make 2 more efforts in the final lectures of this course.